Good noon, and welcome to... Here we go. All right, sorry, sound was a little weird. Okay, good noon, and welcome to the Penguin Review Show here on Rookery Radio, Real College Radio. Today in the studio, I'm running the soundboard, Dave, here with Tom.
Hello.
And on the line with us today, we have Renée D'Aoust, author of the nonfiction memoir Body of a Dancer. She's also a poet and professor. Runs a dog blog about her dog Tootsie, and wrote an essay for the Penguin Review, which we're working hard as we speak on the 50th issue, which should be done today. So, Renée, you there?
I'm here. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. It's 5 p.m. here in Switzerland.
Yeah, I was going to say, you said you were calling in from Switzerland. What's the weather like?
It's gorgeous. Gorgeous fall weather. Crisp and blue skies.
Yeah, we have blue skies here, surprisingly. Usually it's pretty gray.
As opposed to yesterday's 70 and rain here.
Right. So, Tom, you have some questions and things you want to talk about with Renée?
Oh, yeah. Renée, what was it... You've written a nonfiction memoir. What was it like writing Body of a Dancer? What was your process?
You know, Body of a Dancer really started as a poem, and it started as a poem when I first left dance. So the genesis of the book is really in poetry, and I realized I had more to say, and that poetry couldn't contain that form, couldn't contain everything that I had to share about dance. And it was so many years ago that I wrote the poem that when I started to write nonfiction, I had actually kind of forgotten about the poem. But I had an experience when I was doing my MFA, starting in about 2004. I got very frustrated with my colleagues in my MFA class, as we will. As not uncommon story, right? And
Yeah.
I realized that I was fictionalizing all these experiences that I had lived, and I wanted to tell them slant, but tell them from my experience. And that's when I really started to write Body of a Dancer and went back to that original poem, which was called Theatrical Release, and wove the poem into a longer essay and really found a lot of freedom in that nonfiction form and in telling my story of being a dancer, but also other people's stories of being a dancer in the book.
Okay, so Body of a Dancer was your thesis.
Body of a Dancer was my thesis, and it changed a lot from that thesis, but the initial structure and the initial idea is the same as the thesis. Yes.
How many years did you dance? Like, how long of a period does Body of a Dancer... I know this from reading Body of a Dancer, but I have to ask, how many years does it span?
Body of a Dancer really spans just about, the primary focus of the book is about the early 90s, so it's about 8 years in downtown New York City, in the kind of wild and woolly world of modern dance. But I also incorporate a few other things from my childhood, because I was first a ballet dancer, and I studied ballet as a child for about, very seriously, for 8 or 9 years, and then left dance briefly and returned as a modern dancer as a young adult and moved to New York. And so Body of a Dancer, the memoir, really focuses on that time in New York City.
Have you noticed differences, I'm going to talk about dance a little. Have you noticed differences between modern dance when you were dancing and dancing modern dance now? Like a vast change.
It's such a great question. It's really changed. And some people tell me that it hasn't changed and that it has changed. One of the things that I think is different is that modern dance now is a little more accepting of different body types and different backgrounds than it was before. But I went from having trained in ballet and then training with the Martha Graham Center, and Martha Graham as a modern dance technique. So the difference between ballet, you wear point shoes and you try to defy gravity, and modern dance, you wear bare feet and you go with gravity into the floor. And essentially modern dance is for me, more about the art of being human, and ballet is more about the art and aesthetic of a codified form. But modern dance, as expressed by Martha Graham, who really codified her technique, is a very strict form, and it was very brutal and much more strict than ballet. So when you talk about modern dance, there's such a broad, there's so many different techniques in modern dance, and I focused on one of the hardest techniques and one of the sort of strictest value systems in modern dance. There's been a lot of growth since then, and there's a lot of different kinds of techniques that are probably much more gentle on the body. And so now I would say that modern dance, one of the big differences between my experience of dance is that you really had to do it when you were young and you had to get trained and get into the field. And that didn't necessarily include university training. Now the difference is that for modern dance, people very much take the route of the university system. Almost kind of a similar, it's similar to writing in a way, in the way that so many MFA programs in writing have sprung up in the last 10, 15 years or so. There's a similar thing that has happened in dance as a kind of cultural currency through the university system. So those are some of the differences. But the other difference in terms of dance now is that I write dance reviews from Switzerland. So I see European dance, and European dance, generally speaking, as an aesthetic, is very different from modern dance that you find in the United States.
Okay. Do you have one that you prefer and one that you don't like as much as the other, or?
Yeah, something about writing dance criticism or working as a dance critic and going to dance. I really try to set aside. It's odd, right? You're a critic and you're judging.
Yeah.
But what I try to do is observe, and I try to go. So one of the reasons I started writing more dance reviews when I moved to Switzerland was because I felt so culturally isolated, and I thought dance would be a way into the culture that I could kind of explore some of those differences between American culture and European culture. And I would say that I now am really drawn to dance theater. So one of those names you might know is Tina Bausch, and she was a real leader in dance theater and kind of expressionism. And it tends to be a more whole theater experience, but there also tends to be less physical movement. And the sort of common generalization is that in the United States, no one has any funding for dance, and so everyone spends their time dancing rather than doing theatrical stage productions. Whereas in Europe, they used to, I don't think it's so true now, but they used to have a lot more funding for theatrical production, so they could play a lot more and make a kind of full theater experience with consequently less movement. So it's kind of interesting to think about those aesthetic differences where when I go to dance in Europe, and sometimes those differences, for me, they really work because they're kind of like a difficult piece of writing that you have to let it teach you how to read it, and you have to let a dance teach you how to observe it. Whereas sometimes in the States, when I see dance, it's a lot of movement, and it's exuberant, and it's very exciting and incredible. I'm generalizing. But there's less of a kind of full gestalt in the piece or the performance or the evening.
That reminds me of a video actually that I showed my students earlier today, Sia's Chandelier. Have you seen that video yet?
No, I haven't seen that.
You have to look it up on YouTube. It's a song by a woman named Sia, and the video is Chandelier. And it's one of the young dancers from Dance Moms. They told her to do an interpretive dance, and they just let her go to town. And she's this 12-year-old dancer, and it's amazing.
I'll look that up.
I did it for song analysis. Which brings me to another question. We've never talked about this, actually. What are your experiences teaching? What do you think about it? Do you Do you have any favorite memories?
Teaching writing.
Yeah, teaching writing.
So I think right now, it's interesting we haven't talked about teaching before. I think right now, because I'm teaching online, sometimes I think that my students maybe don't exist. They're virtual. And so when I get a connection with a student that means they're real and I'm real, then that excites me most. And I think what I like most right now is when we have readings in the class, and the readings are really sort of challenging, like it's something that a student hasn't read before. And so I really enjoy getting an email from a student. Recently, for example, a student emailed me that she'd never read anything like Jeremy Schraffenberger's piece. It's called Dropping Babies, and it's at Brevity online. And she'd never read anything like it before, and it was completely distressing to her and inspiring to her. I think that's my favorite part of teaching right now. Which, does that answer your question? Because it's almost like my favorite part of teaching is getting students to read more.
Yeah, definitely. David, what are your feelings?
It's interesting. So you're doing a lot of distance ed learning then, with working online with them?
Exactly, I am.
I hear a lot of I hear it's an interesting thing because there is a big shift in terms of teaching writing to move to distance ed. Just because for a lot of students, it seems like writing's not a very interesting subject. Writing essays, things of that nature. I always try to spend time, at least at the beginning of the semester, stressing the importance on both the kind of intrinsic and extrinsic value levels of motivation. Just like, this is something that can, get you a good job, but also writing's important to us as a species of, whatever, however you feel about that.
Mm-hmm.
But it would seem like that's a big possibility that it seems like they don't exist when it's a distance ed thing, because it's hard enough when they're physically there to get them to engage you. So I don't know, is that more challenging to get them to engage now that they're not actually physically within the same space as you?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's kind of like, something I feel recently is that the distance ed, because everything's written, I could do more with video, but I resisted doing that because one of the things that my class does is everything's written, and every email is written, every assignment, every discussion, it's all written, and that reveals so much so quickly about what students are struggling with in terms of using words and communicating, expressing themselves, in terms of letting sort of belief rule the roost rather than thinking more logically through another person's opinion or another side of an issue. So lately I find the distance ed kind of creating more possibilities, I think.
That's interesting.
But I have to say I've built in a lot of, I don't know that they're tricks, but I have quite a few things I do insist on now to make sure that the students stay engaged and don't slip away. So, for example, it depends on what program you're using, but at one of the schools where I teach, we use Blackboard.
Yeah, we use that here.
Yep.
And then do you use Turnitin with Blackboard?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Turnitin, you can see whether the student has read the feedback, right, for the essay. So if I've written feedback, I can see whether the student has accessed that feedback in a way that in a face-to-face class, if I just hand them a paper, I don't really know whether they've looked at that feedback or not.
That's true.
It's such a nice feature.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I've started to do with that, I don't know how you two feel about this, but I insist that a student reads previous feedback before I will give further feedback on a subsequent essay.
Oh, that's actually really, really smart. I never thought to do that.
Yeah, that's one thing I always ask, too. I mean, part of it is I have to depend on the honesty of the student. Not to say students are evil people, but generally, I mean, there's going to be a level of dishonesty there. And so it's like, did you read my feedback? Have you checked the assignment sheet? Sometimes when you just when you're blunt with them, you'll get the no, I'm sorry, I didn't. And then it's like, well, then go ahead and redo this. Or when you've actually taken a look at the feedback I left you, then we can talk.
Right.
I conference a lot. I conference for every single paper, and I usually conference all day. I spend at least 20 to 25 minutes with each student. It doesn't always take that long. But going through the paper and looking at things and leaving feedback and then kind of discussing with them on the spot my thoughts and opinions about their essay. That seems to help.
When you're conferencing, have you read the paper ahead of time, or are you doing it in real time with them right then?
That's a good question. When I first started doing it, I did the leave digital feedback, email it to them all over the weekend, expect that they read it, and then when we met for conferencing, hope that they read it and we could discuss it. And that just didn't work out because a lot of them got there and it was like, all right, did you look at your feedback? No. It's like, okay. And then I'm just reading what I wrote back to them, and I was like, and then I forgot. By the end of it, I didn't know what was going on. So what I do now is I have them print their essay, bring it, and then I read it on the spot. And then as I'm going through, I'm making comments and engaging them in some sort of dialogue about their essay right there on the spot. And that has worked far more for me, at least, than the other way I was doing it.
Yeah, that sounds like a really smart use of time.
It's just because, it's like, oh, I already turned the rough draft in, I'm going to get my points. I don't typically grade the rough draft in the sense that, like, oh, there's some commas missing, there's a typo here or there, you don't get your points. Usually it's, did you do the rough draft? Was it in vein of did it follow the assignment sheet? Was it the right length? Okay. Then did you show up to conferences? Okay, you get your points. I don't want to, dock them. Obviously, the final draft, that's a different story. But the thing is, am I going to really get up on a Saturday or Sunday to... I mean, I personally would because a little more invested, but they, it's like, I don't really care. Most of them don't really care about the class, which is unfortunate. Mm-hmm. You try your best to get them motivated. That's something I'm researching now in another class, student motivation. But yeah, it's tricky. It's a balancing act. Some students generally care. Some you got to pull them in. Others, it's just, hey, it is what it is.
Yeah, and others maybe they don't care until they do care, and then they're frantic. And those are tough students because suddenly they care very much. I tend to gravitate. I mean, I suppose the other thing about distance ed is that I can tell very quickly who's engaged because I hear from them through email, and we kind of have a record of they tend to reach out, and so that's really helpful in terms of my time and. I'm responding to students who are reaching out, who have to take the initiative to start. But it's also not the best environment. If a student isn't a strong reader, I don't think taking literature or English comp online is a good place to take it.
Yeah, that would sound challenging because then if the professor doesn't live anywhere near you, it's kind of hard. You got to go get a tutor or something like that to help you out. And
yeah, for you, it's extreme distance learning because you're teaching students in the United States when you're really not even close to there.
That's right. And it works to my advantage, though, because most of my students are in the Pacific or Mountain Time Zone, and so I'll often answer their emails first thing in the morning for me when it's late in the evening for them. And so
okay.
The communication is sometimes much more quickly done than when I'm actually in the same time zone as them.
Now, I'm not entirely familiar with the minute details of distance ed. Is there this might sound silly, so forgive me, but is there some sort of attendance policy? Obviously, you have assignments and points to get them to do the work and some accountability, but is there a way of, like, attendance? How exactly, I'm sorry, just for someone who isn't entirely familiar how the process works, how exactly does, like, distance ed work? You get online at a certain time with them, or how does that? work
no,
exactly?
Actually, usually it's asynchronous, so they can, so the assignments are available. I tend not to make the whole semester, of course, available all at once, because then it's not cumulative. But the program, depending on what program the school uses, the program can show you access and length of access. That doesn't necessarily correlate to learning or education, but it does correlate to a student spending time on the site, right? And so you can see whether they've read the materials or whether those materials have been downloaded, how much time and how often they've been on the site. But some of that, like in terms of attendance, just showing up and reading the material usually online isn't counted as attendance. Usually completion of an activity or an assignment counts towards attendance online, because it's too hard to know whether the student is there or not. And
Yeah, I see. I wrestle with, philosophically, I guess I wrestle with the idea of attendance. While I understand, like an attendance policy, I should say. On the one hand, I get it and I understand it, because you need to have some sort of accountability to get students to show up. But strictly speaking, college level, high school and things of that nature, that I understand. But strictly speaking at the college level, I always feel like there's a level of responsibility. It's kind of like idealism versus realism. I feel ideally there should be a level of responsibility that the students have, that they should be putting on themselves as assumingly they're adults, to show up and do the work. And I just have a hard time with attendance sometimes, because it's like, okay, it is a simple process of just looking through and checking everybody off. But then the problem becomes the negotiation of excused versus unexcused. I know here at YSU they just implemented an excused absence policy, it isn't terrible. I get it and I understand it, but then it becomes a tricky thing, because I teach Tuesday, Thursdays. And my absence policy is, once you've missed 4 days, which is 2 weeks, I start docking points. But then if there's excused absences, so I've got to negotiate, well, do I even have that then? Should it all be excused? And then it just becomes this tricky, messy thing where students they can get a doctor's note, but where some of them go and get a doctor's note from like a friend or things like that. And then it's like, well, now I got to let you make up work. And it just becomes a tricky mess. So, yeah, I'm not a big fan, ideally, I guess, of an attendance policy, but then at the same time I understand the reality of the situation. You need to have some kind of accountability for the students, so that's interesting.
I mean, I'm still, in terms of attendance, like, for example, I lean toward you, because I feel like it's not my business to administrate attendance. It's too much time. It takes all my time, and hunting and pecking through who's, sort of taking care of the responsibility, which is their responsibility. They signed up for the course.
Yeah, they're adults.
Absolutely.
Oh, and also I feel like one of the ways that, so I have a very strict policy of no late papers, because that's the other side of the online teaching, which is that the late papers just become a complete mess. It's just an administrative mess. And absolutely. I realize that life happens, but at the same time, I think from my experience, and maybe I'm jaded, but I think that students need more help showing up and being present and turning things on time with a specific due date that is non-negotiable, because it just seems like I have so many students who haven't done that.
Yeah, that oftentimes me and Tom, we had our practicum class together, which was kind of the first half of it was getting us ready to teach, and then the second half was, okay, how's it going your first time out? And oftentimes, all our discussions, and I'm not knocking the class, it's a valuable tool, and I enjoyed the class, and it was great, so nothing bad to say about that, but oftentimes the discussions would turn into attendance. It became a joke at the end when our professor had us write evaluations. The joke was, please, not so much attendance next time. But that was the thing. It got really tricky, and then it got into all these, like, well, what if this very ridiculous, very specific circumstance takes place? How do you handle this situation? And like you said, life does happen, and that's totally, like, I try to be super respectful of that. But now it becomes a thing. It's like, well, somebody passed away. Well, it's like now I've got to ask for some kind of documentation. That's the new policy. And it just becomes very awkward for me to go, well, can you give me an obituary? But at the same time, it's like, but they could be just fibbing. So I don't know. It just becomes tricky with those kinds of things.
Or just cut an obit out of the newspaper.
Yeah. And
yeah, so gruesome. I mean, I know it's Halloween soon, but really.
Yeah.
Yep.
Not empathetic and gruesome. And I think that's how come I didn't used to have a no late papers policy, but now I pretty specifically have no late papers at all. And I do, if a student has really dire circumstances and contacts me, of course I'll make special, extensions or what we need to do. But generally speaking, it has relieved me of so much administrative stress so that I can focus on the teaching and the content and emails and written feedback. It's really made a big difference for my time.
Absolutely. It is kind of a balancing act sometimes, having to deal with the attendance and then late papers, and I've already had to deal with it this semester. So, ironically, the students that I had to deal with it with have stopped coming to my class, but that's a different story. So, it's just one of those things that you want to give someone the benefit of the doubt, but at the same time, it's always, you got to be a little skeptical. So
yeah, you want people, there's professional too, and if we're in an online world and if work is online, then you need to be extra careful that you get things in on time and that you don't rely on technology to be there in the last 5 minutes of a due date.
Absolutely. Do you do? I'll ask you one more question, and then we'll take a quick break, and then I'll come back with some more questions. But do you do a revision? Do you do revisions? Do you have a revision policy? I should say. Sorry.
I used to do revisions, and I used to also do peer review, and I've actually gotten rid of that. I guess over the last 2 years, maybe even 3 years ago, I stopped doing peer review, and then I stopped doing revisions because it wasn't happening, and as much as it needed to happen, the students just it just wasn't happening, and so I ended up. I do a unit on it, and I certainly focus on editing and revision, but I don't make it a part of the papers anymore.
Now, that's with the distance ed learning?
Yes, that's with the distance ed learning. I think if I were teaching face-to-face, it would be quite different. I would have revision again, and I would also have peer review as part of the class time. But with distance ed, it became very cumbersome, and it just didn't seem effective. And I'm speaking both for the revision process and for the peer review process, both of which you can do, right, with the program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and I just didn't see that it was having an effect.
I think
can you hear the pain in my voice? I hate not having that as part of
Yeah.
I think that it definitely has an effect whether or not you're being taught or even talking to your peers face to face, because you can get this help from them. Okay, that's great, but if you can't get somebody in front of you telling you what's going on, pointing to the problem, explaining something, then it's just going to be difficult because you're going to have to go online again and then ask them, hey, what do you mean by this? And then just a giant pain. So I can see where you're coming from with the peer reviews.
So, and you're saying that face-to-face makes sense. But
yeah.
Distance ed, it seems too cumbersome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yes.
So, Renee, you wanted to read a piece of yours titled Clearing Out, published by the Festival Writer?
I'd love to read it. I will do.
Well, whenever you're ready.
Clearing out. Well, if you don't clear out my way, you'll be dead in two. I see it in your eyes. Black dots. I've seen black dots in eyes my whole life. I always tell the person so. Could be cancer, I say in the checkout line. Might be Parkinson's, I say to my neighbor. Saw my first boyfriend the other day. Red truck. Never did move beyond driving a red truck. Going to be a car accident for you, I say. T-bone. If you clear out, you'll be okay. My way, I say. It's very helpful to give hope to the black dot unhopeful. It's hard for me, seeing so right when others see so wrong. It's hard, and I'm upfront about that. Saw my sister's daughter, my niece. She doesn't visit me much. And I said, you best clear out my way, or I think you'll go blind. Auntie, she said, where does your knowing come from? Always had it, I say. The night shift at the hospital helps, because when I'm organizing pills on the cart, I take a break, and I look at the patients, if they're asleep. If they're asleep, I can see where the black dots are in their bodies. Then I read the chart to see if my diagnosis matches. Usually does. If it doesn't, I change the chart. Even a doctor needs a bit of help to stand vertical. The hospital is beautiful at night. All those bodies waiting to love gravity like they've never loved it before. The end.
It was very nice. Very eerie. Goes with the Halloween tone. We got Halloween coming up Friday, so that's pretty cool.
That's for Halloween. Thank you.
If you don't mind me asking, what inspired that piece?
Well, that piece actually comes from a writing exercise, and it comes from an exercise of trying to put himself in a sort of paranoid circus frame. And the speaker who sees things and has to share, the speaker has to share his or her paranoid fantasies and convince someone that they're true. And that was the writing prompt, essentially, that open. And it was from a writing workshop with the writer Claire Davis and Sean Ray, actually last summer. And so the piece came out of that prompt, and just as a piece of flash fiction. But the black dot comes from the inspiration. It comes from when my mom was ill. My mom had cancer several times in her life, and people always had really good advice for her, which I say sarcastically. It seemed like everybody knew what was wrong and what should be done to fix it. And I found that really frustrating, and so that's the deeper story behind this.
One sec, Renee. Are you still there?
I'm here.
Okay, you were cutting out there for a sec. Okay. So what is your writing process like? Because everybody has their own process for completing something. How do you usually, let's say a short story or something, how do you usually go about completing that? How's the usual process go for you?
The usual process is a total mess. It seems like that's the usual process, no matter what the form is or no matter the genre, that it's always a total mess, and I always feel as if I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, full confession here, I really feel like I don't know what I'm doing when I'm doing it. The only time I feel like I know what I'm doing or may have a modicum of training in what I want to do is when I'm editing. I love editing. And so now what I tell myself and what my process is just to write as much crap as possible when I'm writing my first draft. And the first draft usually comes from ideas that I write in a little notebook. So I have a little notebook with me all the time, and I'm always writing little ideas in it. And then those little ideas, when they stick around, they become a story or an essay. And or there'll be a reference about a feeling. So that's kind of the initial recording of the idea. But in terms of the actual writing, if I'm in a really intense time where I have to complete some writing, I keep a schedule and I make a schedule and that. But if I'm kind of flailing around, then it's
real quick, Renee, you're breaking up. One more time. I'm sorry.
At what part did I break up?
Probably the last 2 or 3 sentences.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, you know what I did? I just repeated myself. I just try to write as much as possible for our first draft.
Okay.
So you said you write everything down in a small notebook. Have you ever? Now those are usually ideas. You said.
Usually they're ideas, and sometimes it'll be a slightly longer outline. Sometimes it'll just be a title, and sometimes it'll actually be a quote that someone said. Or sometimes I'll write down something mean that someone did to me that I want to be sure to write about.
Have you ever taken different ideas? Maybe you wrote, let's say Friday you wrote down an idea, and then 2 weeks later on like a Thursday you write down an idea. Have you ever gone back and flipped through and said you used maybe a couple ideas connected and you were able to write something from that? Or
Yes, I've done that. And then the other thing I've done is I've looked back over those little books. So, for example, I did this last summer. I looked back over a couple of my little tiny notebooks. They're small enough for a pocket.
yeah.
Looked back over those and found ideas that I had then written, but I had forgotten that I had the idea written down in the little notebook. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so it seems to be this kind of mystical thing that happens with writing, but I don't think it's that mystical. I think it's in the act of writing, like that we have the imagination and we have the various ideas. Well, in nonfiction, whether it's imagination or just ideas from experience. And then I think in the act of writing it down, there's something that connects us to the page that keeps that idea current.
So do you write every single day?
I don't, not lately. I used to. I used to be very militant.
How would you, in that militant phase, did you used to say, okay, I want to write at least an hour a day, and was there a specific time of day you like to write, or was it just whenever during the day?
No, that militant phase was very organized, and I did it when I was writing Body of a Dancer, my memoir, and I would write from 8 to 12 or 9 to 1 or 9 to 2, at least 4 days a week. If I couldn't do 5 days a week, I would do like Monday through Thursday and then also Saturday and Sunday morning. And that's when I was keeping a very specific schedule, and I wouldn't let it be interrupted. I just wouldn't change that schedule. It was like a job. And so I showed up on time, and I clocked out, and that was very, very useful.
That's excellent practice to have that. I've actually noticed while doing my thesis, which is terrible, that I haven't been writing as much when right now I'm supposed to be editing and doing that. And I'm, okay, well, I wonder what's going online for 3 hours. Disconnecting online, just backing off that for 3 hours at a time to write, that kind of thing really helps.
It really helps. It's actually staying kind of keeping yourself protected, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the process that you described earlier, when you said that you were just writing, putting things on paper whenever you write, I do that too, not knowing necessarily if it's good, but throwing all of my ideas on paper. Say, I know exactly the event and the person, and I'm going to be writing about that event, writing about that person, knowing that the entire essay may change. But if you get 1 or 2 good pages out of 20, you've done something right.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. The other thing I started doing with my little notebooks, I used to write down when I wrote my notes, I was too cryptic. I didn't give myself enough clues about where the idea came from. So now I try to be a little more thorough so that I'm not so at a loss when I look back over those ideas.
Oh yeah, the details thing, that'll definitely always help with nonfiction. You can never have too many precise details.
And when you keep your notebook, will you write down where you had that idea and why you had it?
Well, with me, it's more stories about my family growing up. I wish I had a notebook all of those times. And I basically outline one person in each piece, 3 people so it's 21 essays. My mom, dad, sisters, they all get theirs, but it's just growing up from the time that I was 5 years old until the time that I was 27 years old. So I don't have notebooks for that, except I think three cases I had journals that I could look at.
And as part of that process of writing, did you do any interviewing of your family members?
Yes, actually, I did. I interviewed my sisters, and I asked my mom a bunch of questions. My dad answered a few questions. He's read some stuff.
And is that helpful? I suppose, obviously, yes.
Well, yes, in some circumstances, no in others. A sister may say, I never did that, and then you'll have the other sister say, yeah, you did.
And then do you write that into the stories as well?
You mean the recollection or non-recollection?
Or the contradiction about the recollection?
No, I don't work that in. I should, though. Actually, it might be quite funny in a few cases, because most of mine are humorous essays.
That might be that's neat. I'm looking forward to reading it.
Well, thank you. That's my thesis.
I have a question, Renee. Tom mentioned to me you have a blog about your dog, Tootsie. I have 2 cats. I love my cats. I always make up stories about them, at least in my head. But can you give us some details about that?
Yes, it's called Bicontinental Dachshund. And I started it, actually I was having a very difficult time writing after I lost my mom. And so we had rescued a little dachshund named Tootsie per airline specifications, so she could fly back and forth between Switzerland and Idaho. And I had thought about writing a blog about living in Switzerland, but it seems kind of ridiculous to add another expat abroad writing about Europe, I don't know, something just seems sort of like it'd been done. But I thought, what about a Dachshund experience of living on 2 different continents? And I was also having trouble, personally as a writer, I was having trouble writing, and I needed a way to kind of warm up for the distinct.
Oh, one sec, Renee. You're breaking up. Are you still there?
Yep, here I am.
Okay. So do you write? Does the blog take the? Is this your Dachshund from the Dachshund's perspective? Like the Dachshund's, I'm walking around Switzerland, or is it just you writing about your Dachshund?
No, it's from the Dachshund perspective.
That sounds pretty cool.
It's hilarious.
But I have to help her, because she doesn't have opposable thumb, right? And what I really want to be sure is that I extend a call for, we welcome guest posts, and we welcome guest posts by cats, too, if your cats have something to share.
Okay.
And that's extended to writers in the audience and to Tom. If you'd like to do a guest post, it can be very, sometimes pet has a lot to say, and other times it's just a poem. It's really up to the pet.
Okay, that sounds interesting. Yeah, Lenny's a ninja mercenary. That's one of my cats. He's a ninja mercenary in my head. He's always scheming something that he never quite follows through with. That's cool.
Well, it's funny because I was interviewed at a great blog called Coffee with Canines, and the author of the blog specifically asked me to speak.
Oh, hold on. You're cutting out again, Renee. Sorry. Can you say that again?
The Coffee with Canine blog interviewed us about Body of a Dancer and also about Bicontinental Dachshund, and the writer of the Coffee with Canine blog asked us specifically to write as a human, not as the Dachshund.
That's interesting. So it's called Bicontinental Dachshund, just to make sure I'm hearing you right.
That's correct. Bicontinental Dachshund, blogspot.com.
Okay, Blogspot. Sorry, I'm writing this down. Spot.com. Now, do you care if we share this on the Penguin Review website for the listeners so they can access it as well?
I'd love that. That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. So,
I think that you're going to get a lot of guest posts.
yeah, now that you said that.
Definitely.
That would be wonderful.
That'll motivate me to write something this week because I've been a bit lazy.
Also, can be accessed through my webpage as well.
Okay. Would you mind mention? What's your website? The name of your website?
The name of my website, I'll spell it out because it's Renée D'Aoust, but the last name, I'll spell it. So it's www.renee, ReneeDaoust.com. So phonetically, it would be ReneeDaoust.com.
Okay, so www.ReneeDaoust.com.
Correct.
Cool. And as the listeners and myself, we can find all of your work and things. Is it available on there as well, or?
You can find links to online writing and links to book reviews that I do, event schedule, and also how to contact me. I love to hear from people.
Oh, cool.
Are you working on any new books of poetry, memoirs?
I'm working on a chapbook, which is a hound, I call it a hound cycle, and it's about my plot hound, Truffle, and that's a kind of a epic poem in chapbook form. And then I'm also working on a new book project about our family forest land in Idaho, and that's a memoir in the process.
Is Tootsie ever going to get a book?
Oh, I would love, my vet keeps asking me to write a book, and I would love that. That's a dream of mine. So I hope so.
I think that you need to suggest this collaboration with Tootsie sooner rather than later.
I agree, right? Thank you.
Yep. I definitely think that would have a large readership, especially just with how many people have dogs and they have cats and ferrets, lizards, whatever, and they don't. A lot of these people don't necessarily think to write from the point of view of the animal, and then when they stop to think, oh well, I wonder what my pet thinks about this, they're highly disturbed.
Yeah, and also the pets. One of my favorite dog books is called Life of a Dog, and it takes place in Hungary during the latter part of the 1950s, and this dog is essentially experiencing, the beginnings of a police state, and it's just a fascinating read. Life of a Dog.
Oh, yeah, because they definitely go through depression, anger. They sense what their humans are feeling, that kind of thing.
And also, I think that a pet of a writer has a particular amount of work to do because writers need so much fur therapy.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Our pets also get to see us in probably our most private moments.
Mm-hmm.
My cats love to spy on me when I take a shower. If I leave the door open anyways, you just have to lock them out. So.
Have to watch out for the ninja assassin during that moment.
Will a ninja cat go in the shower?
What he'll do is, if I leave the door open, he sits right there at the entryway of the bathroom, so that he's a safe enough distance so I can't, sometimes, because he used to get real close, and what I do is, the water that would collect on my fingers, flick my fingers, so, a little sprinkle would hit him, and then he'd take off running because he hates water. So now he's a safe enough distance away, but he'll just sit there with this dead stare on his face, mm-hmm. My other cat, though, she'll come in and she'll whine in, terror, are you okay, kind of thing. Yeah. So animals get a unique perspective. But we're almost out of time, Renee. Is there any last thoughts, anything you'd like to plug, tell the listeners about? Anything coming up, things like that you want to tell us about? I know we mentioned some of it already, but it's just like a recap.
I have a piece coming up in Tri-Quarterly Review, which is from a talk I gave at AWP last spring. I'm really excited about that. And I also have a creative nonfiction piece coming up in December at Volt. And that's kind of an experimental piece that has poetry right in the creative nonfiction, along with an interspersed dance review. It's a very experimental piece, and that'll be up. A link to that will be up at my webpage too. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank you both so much for the conversation and the great time together on the radio. Thank you.
Well, thank you for calling in.
For calling
we really
in.
appreciate it. One more time, your website and also the blog for those listening.
So Tootsie, my miniature Dachshunds blog, is Bicontinental Dachshunds Blogspot.
Okay.
And my webpage is www.reneedaoust.com.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Renée, for calling in. We really appreciate it. A lot of valuable information and perspective, given us both as writer, teacher, and as a pet owner as well. Some cool ideas. I'll try not to send something too ridiculous to your blog about my cat. But now that you said that, you've piqued my interest, so I might send something in. So thank you again for calling in. And we'd like to thank everybody for listening in. We'll be posting all of Renee's website information on the Penguin Review page, so check us out there. We're hard at work right now on the 50th anniversary issue, which Renee will also be appearing in.
Yeah.
So keep
Almost
an eye out
done.
for that. Anything you want to say, Tom, before we go?
I had a question for Renee. Renee,
Oh.
are you going to be around anytime soon? Pittsburgh, Cleveland, doing readings.
As soon as I'll be, it's not even close, I'll be at AWP next
Seattle,
spring.
right?
Next spring is Minneapolis.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then that's the closest shot for now.
Alrighty.
All right, well, thank you, Renee, for calling in, and thank you for those who listened in. We'll be back Friday, same time, 12 to 1, here on the Penguin Review Show, only on Rookery Radio, Real College Radio. We'll leave you with the auto DJ, whatever it's playing, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
All right, thanks.
Thanks.